Prima di invitarlo sul palco, Kumi, vi leggo alcune note su di lui. Ha una vita straordinaria. Per chi di voi si vorrà fermare con lui a chiacchierare, sarà un'esperienza incredibile. È un attivista sudafricano e fino a dicembre 2015 è stato il direttore esecutivo di Greenpeace, di cui è stato il primo direttore di origine africana. È nato a Durban, in Sudafrica. Naidoo si trovò impegnato nella lotta contro l'apartheid sino dall'età di 15 anni, quando fu espulso da scuola. Era impegnato in organizzazioni di quartiere, lavoro giovanile nella comunità e mobilitazione delle masse contro il segregazionismo. È stato amico di Nelson Mandela. È stato arrestato diverse volte, variamente accusato di violazione delle norme contro l'assorbimentazione delle masse, disobbedienza civile, violazione dello stato di emergenza, cioè è una persona per bene, quindi bisogna proprio ringraziarlo per essere qua. Si è dato alla latitanza, è espatriato in Inghilterra perché era sotto mandato della polizia, ha ottenuto la borsa di studio all'Università di Oxford e ha conseguito il dottorato in sociologia politica, quindi anche un nostro dottore. Naidoo è entrato in Greenpeace nel 2009, ma di Greenpeace gli è piaciuta soprattutto l'inclinazione verso la disobbedienza civile e quindi ha dichiarato di aver visto per sé dentro Greenpeace un'altra possibilità come agente di cambiamento. Sono veramente lieto, ho chiacchierato con lui altrove, ho chiacchierato con lui ieri pomeriggio ancora una volta, sono davvero grato, lieto che dopo un lungo viaggio dal Sudafrica sia venuto con noi a chiacchierare questa mattina. Grazie Naidoo.
Thank you. Grazie. Good morning, everybody. I'm so sorry I don't speak Italian. I know grazie mille, allora, and ciao. But let me tell you, I'm very nervous today for many reasons. For one, today is Friday the 13th. Secondly, I'm scared of upsetting the feminists in the audience because you have an all-male closing plenary, but I looked and I saw the opening speakers were all women. So I can go back to South Africa thinking that while Italy has made some progress in terms of gender equality, men still have the last word. But the third reason I'm nervous is because I'm in a terrible sleep deficit, and I came from Johannesburg yesterday, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was woken up by a song that made me think that I was in the middle of Second World War as part of the anti-fascist movement. And there was, given how loud the song was, I think at least about 60 people were involved in that singing. So I would like that song to be played.
Stamattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invaso, oh partigiano, portami via.
Okay, but more seriously, anywhere I speak these days, I am deeply anxious because of one response that I get. And that is, if I start saying to people that we are currently living in a moment of extreme urgency, of extreme crisis, that our forests are being destroyed at the rate of every 2 seconds, the forest the size of a football field is being destroyed. When we talk about the fact that we are running out of time on climate, it's not simply that we don't have the solutions for climate change. We have the solutions now, but what we don't have is the time to do it as fast as we need to do it. And our political and business leaders are still holding us back. And so anyway, I was speaking in the United States some years ago, and I was going through all of this, but also talking about the humanitarian crisis, the refugee crisis, the fact that today we live in a world of deepening inequality that is completely unsustainable and unacceptable. And at the end of my speech, a woman in the audience put up her hand and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And then I said, "Yes, I heard of him, of course, when I was a young activist in the anti-apartheid movement. He was somebody who really inspired many of us." And she then asked me, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" And I thought it was a trick question, so I very tentatively said, "I have a dream?" And she shouted back at me, she said, "Yes! It was I have a dream. When I hear you speak, it sounds as you have a nightmare. The forests are being destroyed, the climate is being destroyed, and so on." So one of the challenges of leadership that we face today is how do we speak truth to power on the one hand, but also do it in a way that doesn't make people feel that their participation, engagement, and involvement is not something that is valuable, important, and can ultimately have impact. I want to now ask you to watch a video from Martin Luther King, which I hope will challenge your thinking about how you think about your own work. Over to Martin Luther King.
That is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
So just to repeat that last bit, he said, "I refuse to be well adjusted to the idea that we would take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are being smothered in an airtight cage of poverty." My dear brothers and sisters, I want to say to you that in the world of philanthropy, in the world of fundraising, in the world of business and politics today, we must question ourselves about whether in fact we too have become well adjusted to actually things that are completely unacceptable, unjustifiable, immoral, and so on. The level of inequality that we see in the world today, not only is it unjust, it is what is driving us to climate catastrophe. Now, given that I saw somebody pull out the handkerchief and were wiping their tears, I just want to tell you, or maybe it was not the eyes, but I also have a cold at the moment, by the way. I just want to give you some good news. And I hope my former colleagues at Greenpeace who are in the audience are not too upset with what I'm about to say. I want to say to you that we, in the environmental movement and so on, are very fond of saying, save the planet, save the climate, save the environment. So I want to say, actually, we have some good news. The planet does not need saving. The planet is just fine. Really, the planet is fine. Why? Because if we continue the way that we are, and continue to burn oil, coal, and gas and the fossil fuels and warm up the planet, what will be the end result? The end result will be that we'll warm up the planet to a point where we will be gone, the planet will still be here. It'll be bruised, battered, and scarred by humanity's crimes on it. But quite frankly, once we become extinct as a species, once all of us are gone, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let's be very clear. This struggle that we are engaged in is whether humanity can coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's futures. The planet has an incredible capability to heal itself. What we are doing to it is a crime, but we need to understand that this is about survival. And where I come from in Africa, where I'm currently leading the African Civil Society Initiative, which is trying to unite NGOs, trade unions, faith organizations, cultural artists, people living in the African diaspora, and so on, into a movement to fight corruption, climate, poverty, inequality, and shrinking democratic space, I am confronted with the harsh reality that the climate impacts have started, and sadly, one of the terrible injustices is that even though the African people as a whole, or the people in the Pacific, or people in the Caribbean, or people in other parts of the developing world have been least responsible for carbon pollution and climate change, but we are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price in terms of impacts. We are losing land, we are losing water, we are losing food, ability to grow food and so on, and you should be under no illusions. Climate impacts are happening right now. So when we think about our role and how do we try to change the world we live in, and all of us who are in the broad non-profit sector, I want to quickly suggest that we need to challenge the way we think about what we do. So there are three ways in which we can think about how we can intervene in the public space: macro, meso, and micro. By that I mean, by macro I mean trying to change governance, such as trying to reform the World Bank or the IMF, or trying to change South Africa from apartheid to democracy. Those kinds of changes at the macro level take time. They don't happen quickly. And if you look at the amount of money, time, and effort that's going into changing the big injustices, the structural injustices, the systemic injustices that we face, I would say it's no more than 5%. Especially when you look at it from a fund, from money, where resources are going to. Then at the middle level, it's where many of us, increasingly, sorry, I told you today is the 13th of May. Policy change. So if you look at policy change, this is where, if you're working on an issue like violence against women, you don't simply put your resources into only addressing the survivors of violence, creating shelters, counseling for women, and so on, but you say to your government, we want a law that protects women in their homes, we want domestic violence legislation, and so on, and that's what we mean by pushing for policy changes. Now, there's been an increase of effort in this kind of work, but it needs to increase much more. Still, most of the resources go into delivery of projects and programs, and I'm not saying that that is bad. Many things that we all do are good things, but if we put our efforts solely in addressing the problem through projects and programs, all we are doing is treating the symptoms of the problem without treating the root causes. So for those who have money to give, they have a simple choice. They must either decide whether they are engaged in genuine philanthropy that comes with the love of humanity, or whether they're engaged in philanthropy, where they're fooling themselves that in fact you are actually having the impact, because either they want quick results, or they want, because some person who made a lot of money somewhere as a pet project or some special interest. So we have to begin to challenge how we think about philanthropy and the very framework of philanthropy. Is it okay that we have a system where people can accumulate so much of huge amounts of money, and then we hope that some of them will give it away? Or do we in fact need to fundamentally start rethinking whether in fact philanthropy needs to rise to a much higher level of moral courage and commitment and the ability to make the changes that we need? So we can no longer be relying on incremental change, by which I mean small changes. We have to be addressing the root causes. But part of this is about rethinking how we accept what is acceptable and what is unacceptable practice. To a lot of the time, we are told in the name of rule of law, we need to actually behave in a particular way. Now, most of us, in broad terms, would say that actually we don't have a fundamental problem with the rule of law. But even how we think about the rule of law, we need to actually step back and ask ourselves, is rule of law ideas actually holding us back from thinking differently and acting differently? So this year is Matt Damon, and I understand he's popular in Italy, and he is reading a speech from the 1940s by Howard Zinn, who was a very famous labor historian in the United States. Please listen carefully to what he has to say.
The topic is civil disobedience. You're saying our problem is civil disobedience. That is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war. And millions have been killed because of this obedience. We recognize this for Nazi Germany. We know that the problem there was obedience, that the people obeyed Hitler. People obeyed. That was wrong. They should have challenged, and they should have resisted. But now we have Western civilization, the rule of law. The rule of law has regularized and maximized the injustice that existed before the rule of law. That is what the rule of law has done. When in all the nations of the world, the rule of law is the darling of the leaders and the plague of the people, we ought to begin to recognize this. We have to transcend these national boundaries in our thinking. Nixon and Brezhnev have much more in common with one another than we have with Nixon. J. Edgar Hoover has far more in common with the head of the Soviet secret police than he has with us. It's the international dedication to law and order that binds the leaders of all countries in a comradely bond. That's why we're always so surprised when they get together. They smile, they shake hands, they smoke cigars. They really like one another, no matter what they say. We're going to need to go outside the law, to stop obeying the laws that demand killing or that allocate wealth the way it's been done, or that put people in jail for petty technical offenses and keep other people out of jail for enormous crimes.
So one is not saying that we have to, not respect the law. But we need to understand that once upon a time, slavery was legal, apartheid was legal, denying women the right to vote was legal, colonialism was legal, denying people civil rights in the United States was illegal, exploiting our environment today is legal. Just because it's legal does not make it right, does not make it just, does not make it acceptable. And any one of us who are, sorry, please don't clap. Sorry, please don't clap. I got a time restriction. So I want to just say that what is needed by all of us now is what in Greenpeace we called a billion acts of courage. We are willing to actually challenge the way we think and the way we act. And I want to just share with you this clip from somebody who I respected the most from my time at Greenpeace. It's a young woman from Finland who actually spent the following year, this was in 2012, in 2013, she spent 3 months in absolutely difficult conditions in a Russian prison in Murmansk, together with 29 other colleagues. So, sorry, can we just play this quickly, please? This is from 2012 in an action in the Arctic.
It's something that makes me really sad and angry when I get to know about these companies having these terrible plans of drilling oil in very hazardous conditions. And I think this is also a duty for me as a person living up in the Arctic, that I really have to act against it, so this is my chance to do it.
Now is the time for them to change from the outdated business model that has plundered our planet and has driven us closer to catastrophic climate change.
The boats and the people do not represent any threat to safety and security of any person or property or the marine environment. The Razlomnaya platform presents an unacceptable risk to the Arctic environment, both in Russia and globally. The first thing we ask you to do is to stop the hosing because their position becomes unstable and they may fall 15 meters onto the foot of the platform. So we ask you to stop hosing so we can ascertain the situation of the activists. Over.
Arctic sunrise, which is Razlomnaya calling.
We propose you to evacuate all personnel because we will start our water cannons once again. So, and we think that more people will be injured.
I am doing this action for my grandchildren and the grandchildren of the planet. I think it is a catastrophe waiting to happen.
Now is the time of transitioning to clean, safe, renewable energy that delivers energy on the one hand, but does not damage the planet on the other.
So I showed you that. By the way, if you're wondering, the slowest person to get to the top was me, by the way. And so especially to the young people here, if a guy like me, who's now just hit 50, if I'm willing to do it, you can do it. But the important thing I want to say is this. Courage is not simply doing that. When I was a 15-year-old activist in South Africa, when I got involved in my first protest, which was against the inequality in the education system, and I was, leading the march, in the front of the march, and the slogan was, "We want equality." By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV," right? And that's because kids in white schools had television, color TVs, kids in black schools had no television. And for me, it was a very challenging time in my life. My mom had committed suicide a few months earlier at the age of 38. And the moral choice that people like me had to make in this very painful kind of, there was so much tragedy in our lives because apartheid was not only about racial discrimination, with it came high levels of suicide and so on. But we had a simple choice. We either could make a choice to be part of the problem or part of the solution. And we said, to be silent in the face of injustice is a choice that you're making to be part of the problem. So I want to say to you that courage is contextual, meaning that, yes, some of us, for example, my colleagues at Greenpeace, we were able to do that action, which was really important. But sometimes my teacher, when I was 15 years old, who allowed us to have meetings in a house, right, to plot against the government. And I used to know she would look at the curtains to see the special secret police and so on monitoring. But just to allow us to have the meeting in our house was an act of immense courage. So today in Syria, if you're a blogger, or in Bangladesh, if you're a blogger, that is an act of exceptional courage given what can happen to you. So my dear brothers and sisters, the moral choice that we have is not that all of us are going to go climb a rig in the Arctic, but each of us can contribute in different ways and in our different contexts. Sometimes just standing up and saying something that is so different from the mainstream is an act of moral courage. I mean, Bernie Sanders' campaign in the United States at the moment, I would argue, is an amazing act of personal courage to go out there and to present a completely different perspective and do as well as he has done is in fact a pretty courageous thing. So you have to make your own choice about what constitutes courage for you, and all I appeal to you in this message is don't stay within your comfort zone, because your comfort zone will leave you feeling mediocre and will not give you a sense that in fact you are pushing yourself to the limits to meet the extreme challenges in the world. Mahatma Gandhi put it very well when he said, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And Albert Einstein once said, two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and he said, I'm not sure about the universe, right? But he said something more important. He said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Can I just stop and ask you by show of hands, how many of you sometimes feel that that applies to you? I'm putting up my hand. Okay. Clearly there are much less insane people in Italy than in the United States, because when I asked the question, when I spoke at the United States, about 80% of the people put up their hands. So good for you. So I want to tell you a story in concluding. These are the words that are on the tombstone of my best friend, whose name is Kumi Naidoo. It says, I shall pass this way but once. Any good that I can do or any kindness I can show to any human being, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. So I conclude then with a story. Oh, sorry, I was about to give you a presentation, Alberto. Shall I keep going? So I want to end with the story. Let me warn you, the story is a sad story, but don't focus on the sadness. Focus on the inspirational piece of it. I tell you to inspire you. So my friend Lenny and I were 22 years old in the heat of the struggle against the apartheid regime. We were fighting hard to get Mandela out of prison and our other leaders. And we got to a point where, after repeated police harassment and repression, and because we were facing court cases where some of our colleagues were already in prison, we were told, please get out of the country, because you could not assume that if you got arrested and tortured the way we were tortured, that you would not break and give more information to the regime. So we were in a decision where we had to flee the country. And so we were 22 years old. And he asked me the simple question. He was a very philosophical guy. He said, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution we can make to the cause of humanity? I said, that's a very simple question, giving your life. And he said, you mean like how it is in South Africa at the moment, where every other day somebody was being murdered by the police and becoming a martyr, and there'd be a big funeral, and then more people get killed at that funeral, and it was just a vicious cycle. I said, I guess so. And he said to me, no, that's a wrong answer. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old at that time. My friend Lenny was a very philosophical person. He was the first environmentalist I knew. He got it decades before I did. And also at that time, I jokingly say he was probably one of only 1,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. So anyway, we hugged each other. We flee in different directions. And 2 years later, I get the call that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in the bodies, their parents couldn't even recognize them when they went to the mortuary. So I had to think deep and hard about that distinction between giving your life and giving the rest of your life. What Lenny was saying was that the struggle for justice, whether it's social justice, economic justice, climate justice, gender justice, or justice for indigenous peoples, whatever issues we're fighting for, these struggles are marathons, not sprints. They are long-distance race, not a sprint. And the best that we can do, like people like ourselves, who understand the problems in the world, who've had the privilege of an education, who have the ability to contribute, the best contribution that we can make is having the stamina and the perseverance and the courage to continue to fight and fight and fight until justice is actually achieved. Because there are many people in the world, if they, like say Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, if he died 20 years ago, we would remember him as a great revolutionary hero. He stayed on far too long in power, is as abusive in terms of human rights as the previous regimes were, and so on. And it showed that he didn't have the stamina to be true to the cause. So I want to say to you, in my final words, if you are anything like me, then there will be days when you are frustrated. There will be days when you get that letter from a foundation or a trust or a government department that you've applied for funding after 3 months of hard work rejecting your approach. You might feel, in fact, that you and the work that you do is not as important and impactful as it should be. I want to say to you, my dear brothers and sisters, what I do when I reach those moments as well is I say to myself, the struggle for making this world a better place, a safer place, a more just place, a more equal place is a marathon. It's not a sprint. That's what I've learned from my friend Lenny, and I offer you that wisdom. And be sure in the knowledge that the world we live in, the country you live in, Italy, would be much, much more weaker were it not for each and every single one of you and the organizations that you come from for believing and refusing to accept that the world we live in is the best possible world that humanity can create for itself. And be assured that you will not, you might be judged harshly today, but Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, the 3 people who I quoted, and I always quote Rosa Parks as well, all of them, when they were fighting, they were considered as bad people, as terrorists, as all of them. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Martin Luther King was arrested 41 times. Mahatma Gandhi several times. Today, in Washington, D.C., there is a memorial for Martin Luther King that is as big as that for any president. Mahatma Gandhi is cherished in India. Nelson Mandela is the only person where all the nation states of the world at the UN decided that on his birthday in July will be an international day for social action. So don't worry. If people vilify you, tell you you're silly, you are maladjusted, rest assured that history will judge your work positively, and you have a right to think differently, act differently, because we refuse to accept that the world we live in is the best that humanity can create for itself. Thank you very much.
Hey, stay. Kumi. Kumi, you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kumi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kumi, you left Greenpeace
Thank you very much. Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's good. Kumi, you left Greenpeace, you left your non-profit organization. Just give me 2 minutes of what is your next step. What are you going to do in the future? You are unemployed now, okay?
So my friends and family are saying that I'm the most busiest unemployed person they know. So I'm doing something local. I wanted to get back into grassroots work. So with some of my comrades, we set up a non-profit trust called Earthrise Trust. And we are working with 2 villages in 4 hours from Johannesburg, where we're doing climate resilient agriculture, trying to look at new models of rural economic development and so on. And that, at the moment, is giving me the most joy that I've had in a long time to do grassroots work in my continent. The second thing I'm doing nationally is I'm a volunteer ambassador of the South African Communities of Faith Environmental Initiative. All the religious bodies are part of it. And we are trying to defeat a mad plan that my government has to build 9 nuclear plants in partnership with Russia. So that's more an advocacy thing. But the thing that I'm putting most of my time into is trying to unite the African continent. Because, you know, I've jokingly been saying, if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. And I'm not talking about the hairstyle. No, essentially sort of saying that we need more social, economic, and political integration, and we need to push our governments on corruption, on climate, on shrinking democratic space. And then globally, I'm doing another small initiating a project, and maybe it's a good note to end on. Basically, we are very, very, very close to being out of time on climate. Most of our political and business leaders are in denial about how close to the edge we are. In fact, I would go so far as saying, even us in civil society, and I would even say even the environmental movement is in fact in denial about how close to the edge we are. And if you live in the developing world, you can see it every day, whether it's in the Pacific, Asia, and so on. So one of the things, I'm having lots of fun with this, I gotta say, is that if you look at the theory of change that we follow, we campaign against companies destroying forests, oceans, expanding in fossil fuels and so on. We do not have time any longer to go after thousands of companies doing bad things. So we are designing, with a few others, an intervention to rather campaign against companies that are doing bad things, given that all of them have to borrow money from some bank or some lending institutions. We're trying to design a global finance campaign to go after banks and other lending institutions to say, you should not lend to deforestation, you should not lend to fossil fuel expansion, you should not lend to indigenous people's rights being violated. And if we can shut the flow of capital at source, that would give us, as our American friends say, more bang for our buck, meaning more impact. So we're trying to do that. Unfortunately, I miss my colleagues at Greenpeace a lot. I don't miss the responsibility, I must say, of you know, worrying about who's going to get arrested when and so on. But I do miss the infrastructure and support I had, because at Greenpeace I had like 6 people telling me, go here, go there, do this, do that, and everything was organized for me. Now I'm doing a lot of things on my own. It's a very humbling experience.
But there are a lot of friends from Greenpeace also eating over there. So just a big applause around also for them.
But anyway, I have to just end by saying that I came for this invitation because I believe that people in Europe actually have a leadership role to play on trying to address the climate crisis. Europe is the leading region in terms of understanding by the citizens in Europe, always has been ahead.
And the Italian are the more creative one.
And yes, Italy, even though it had its banga parties and all of that.
Come on!
Bye-bye, thank you.